What is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours for Monday, June 7th, 2021. If you are watching us live, there's no one watching us live yet. Oh, we've got a couple people watching us live now. If you are watching us live, welcome. If you are watching the recording for this back later, welcome to you as well. And thank you for watching us here. If this is your second, third, fourth, fifth, maybe some of you guys have watched us every time here. Welcome back to our stream, and thank you for joining again. If this is your first time on our stream, a big welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us. This show is a live Q&A style show about DFS, about SaberSim. We take questions from our Slack community and questions that come in through YouTube, as well as some questions that come in through our support channel about DFS strategy, about how to use SaberSim, about sports betting, whatever you guys really want to talk about, and we answer them live on stream. This is live for a reason. We want clarifying questions. We want follow-up questions. We want to make sure that everyone feels like they're getting their questions appropriately answered. As some of the regulars probably know by now, we really dive deep in here, spend some time on some questions and really talk about all the nuance behind some of these things and make sure everyone's got a strong understanding before we move on. So, let's see. This is also a daily show for a reason. This is not a tout show. This is not a pick show. We are not giving our favorite plays of the day or anything like that here, but we are using the slates and the data we have for today's game to help provide some examples, provide some context. We take a lot of inspiration from what we've got going on the slates that day to influence what we talk about on the show. So if you have questions about today's slate, and I think we do have some of those lined up, feel free to shoot. And if you have more general questions about how to use SaberSim or DFS strategy, we will take inspiration from the slates we have on the table for today and every day to answer those questions. So let's see, a few more housekeeping items. We are using this time slot on Thursdays to host what we are calling strategy sessions, where we get a few other folks from the SaberSim team in. We do a deep dive into a specific DFS concept or sport or slate type or something along those lines. And then, of course, also do a little bit of live Q&A to answer any questions you guys have. We've done 2 of those now already. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a sports betting session with Max, where we talked about sports betting strategies, some prop betting, how to use SaberSim sports betting tool, and how to use Vegas signals and our sports betting tool to help level up your DFS play as well. So that recording is up on our YouTube channel. If you are a sports bettor or are just getting started and interested in learning more, or just a DFS player that is looking to level up your game a little bit more, check out that recording. That was a great strategy session. And last week we did a NBA showdowns and short slate strategy session. So talking about optimal strategy for building NBA showdown lineups, NBA short slate lineups. The playoffs are still going strong here. We're in the semifinals now, I think, in every series. So still plenty of NBA playoffs DFS to come. We've got a small MLB slate today. So maybe that is pushing folks a little bit more in the NBA direction, looking at that 2-game slate or some of these showdowns. So if you have not seen our NBA showdown and short slate strategy session on YouTube yet, please check that out. That recording is also posted. Let's see. So I think that is it here for general housekeeping. It was quite a whirlwind of a DFS weekend. We had a extremely chalky MMA fight get completely canceled after lock, which was a bummer for, I think, a lot of us, myself included. We had John Rahm, the 6-stroke leader after round 3 in the PGA tournament, be forced to withdraw after testing positive for COVID. And what else? There was and James Harden then getting a hamstring injury 30 seconds into the game on the Bucks-Nets game. It was quite a Saturday. I ended up taking Sunday off just because I was the Rahm news actually ended up helping me out, but both of the other things that came up did not. So I took yesterday off. I think Kurt had mentioned in the general channel or the baseball channel this morning, always good to take a day off, or nothing wrong with taking a day off. I completely agree with that sentiment. I actually planned on coming in here and speaking a little bit about that, but always remember to, especially if you have a particularly tilting day, always completely fine and good to take a day off from DFS, especially if you are a grinder like me and you are playing pretty much every slate every day. Can be very refreshing to take a day off. That said, came back to the world of DFS today, ready to rock, and we've got a 2-game MLB slate, which is pretty strange. Can't really figure out exactly why. I guess there's 3 games, but the Marlins and Red Sox game is actually a makeup game, so it wasn't originally scheduled for today. If anyone can tell me exactly how we ended up with a 2-game baseball slate today, let me know. It seems very strange. I can't remember the last time we just had a random day, and it's a Monday too. We typically have pretty strong Monday main slates, so that seems a little weird, but that's okay. We'll spend a little time talking about some short slate MLB strategy today. Nothing wrong with that. We've had some other questions come in on our Office Hours channel. We've had some good questions come in through support and various channels on Slack, so I'm excited to get all into it here. Again, if you have questions, Office Hours channel on Slack, YouTube chat, feel free to pop them in. If you are watching the recording of this and want to get involved in the show, you can email us, support@sabersim.com, and ask a question. Let us know you want us to answer it on stream, and we will. If you are interested in joining our Slack channel and you're not already in there and you are a SaberSim subscriber, send us an email, support@sabersim.com. Let us know. We've got an awesome community in Slack. We'll get you joined right up, and you can start participating here. Thank you again for everyone that has been asking questions so far. We've had some really great topics. You guys have me taking notes here. I've got my chicken scratch notes here, prepping for this show every day because some of these questions are really strong, and I have to spend some time thinking about and preparing before we come on live here. So thank you, everyone. Anyway, without much further ado here, I will go ahead and get us started with some of these questions. So let's see. First off, I will start here with this question from Andrew. This came in the Office Hours channel this morning. And Andrew said, I like using review mode to go over previous plays. A lot of times players will be out and I'll have to quick swap 1 or 2 players out via the entries tab. Is there any way to use review mode from the entries tab or upload the quick swapped lineups into a specific build to update that lineup set? Andrew, this is a great question. I actually had to go back with the rest of the SaberSim team this morning and check in. Unfortunately, there's not a really great way to do this right now when you are using quick swap. When you use a full late swap, you will see it actually creates a brand new build. That build has a name and you can kind of go in there. The next day review mode should pop up as a toggle. But for quick swap, since it is not actually generating a new build and it's just swapping out very quickly those players and then giving you a new CSV to download, we don't have a very good way then to use review mode with that right now. So we realize this is a little bit of a hole in maybe your kind of end-to-end DFS process of building your lineups, potentially having to late or quick swap and then wanting to review the next day. So this is a hole that we'd like to fill at some point. But at the moment, there's not really a great way to do this, to be completely honest. So we're envisioning something kind of like you described, where you could maybe take an entries file and actually take the lineups that you used, upload them in, and then use the review mode tool to study your lineups after the fact. But for now, unfortunately, there's just not a great way to do that. So I realize that's not a particularly satisfying answer, Andrew. If you watch this, if you're watching this live, feel free to chime in if you watch this later. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. I think maybe at some point we'd like to do a little bit more of a deep dive into review mode and maybe some things that you could use there. But that is kind of where we stand right now on that. So great question, though. Definitely kind of a nuanced use case there between the review mode and the quick swap. So okay, cool. So I'm going to keep us moving along here and take us to another question. Okay, so this one came in from CJ in our general channel. Okay, so this question says, so let's say I do a build at 620. I come back and load the same build at 650. Is that set of lineups going to be the same as if it was at 620? This is a great question. This is a good one for me to go ahead and get SaberSim pulled up here on my screen. Boom. All right. Perfect. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So I'm going to run a build here first. So we've just got something to work with here pulled up. All right. So we're going to use default 20. I forgot to update my projections, but we'll do that here in a second. Okay. So let's edit to projections so we can get our lineups unlocked here. And we'll go from there. Okay, so you can see here, my local time, it is a little after noon, 12:10. We just ran this build. We've edited some projections. And we've got this up, right? A few hours, actually, many hours since lock is late tonight, almost 7 hours before lock here. But we've ran a build. And the question is, if I come back to this build later, are the lineups going to be the same, especially if new sims have run? The answer here is a general no, the lineups will not be the same, but there is some nuance and some detail that we need to discuss here about this. So first off, the pool size of 200 lineups has already been built. That is a completed pool. That cannot be changed, right, for this particular build. However, if we run a sim later, and news changes, or particularly a player's ruled out or something like that, and the projections overall change, and you come back to this build and click refresh game and player projections, we are going to update the projections to the most recent values for all the players here, and it may change the individual lineups that get picked out of your 200 that you built that show up in your actual final 20, right? So that can change. We will never overwrite a custom projection here. So even if Eric Hosmer's projection has changed in a later build, since we have edited his projection and made it a custom one, we will not change that. So that's kind of where that line is drawn, right? We will not make new lineups for this build, and we will not update custom projections, but we'll update all the other projections, and we may update the lineups that actually end up showing up here if you refresh, okay? So with that said, what we recommend users to do is, if you have the time, and especially if significant news has come out, which, I mean, baseball on a 2-game slate, it's possible. I don't even think we have all the lineups yet. We don't. So news will probably come out that will change this. We recommend always run a final build before you lock your entries in, rather than coming back to a build that you ran at 12:10 and built 200 lineups with the information we had at this time and just refreshing. You should always build a new build before lock, because it's going to build a brand new full pool of lineups with the most recent up-to-date data. Where this can be useful is if sometimes we'll have a very minor sim where there's not really significant news that is breaking. No players have been ruled out. Sorry, my Slack is popping here. No significant news has come out, but maybe a new sim just happens to run or something like that. If it affects the projections by a very slight bit, maybe a couple players move by like 1/100 of a point, it can be, especially for perfectionists like me, it can be nice to know that when you click this refresh button, it's just going to kind of refresh and re-optimize and pick out the top 20 or top 150 or whatever of your entire pool. So that can be pretty useful. But hopefully that answers your question, CJ. So again, kind of in summary here, best to always rerun a full build before lock and make sure that you are getting the most recent up-to-date data. We will update the actual lineups you are getting here of your entire pool with the newest projections when a user clicks this refresh button to refresh, but we're not going to rebuild lineups, right? Same deal. I don't think this is very likely, but if you had 100%, okay, so we don't have 100%, but let's say we had 100% Dylan Bundy in our entire pool of 200, right? Just as an example. If he later got ruled out and was scratched, we would still have, even if we refreshed our projections, we would still have 200 lineup or 20 lineups well, really 200. We'd still have 200 lineups with Dylan Bundy because we're not remaking new lineups in this build, even though the projections have updated. So that's like a very good example of where you need to be careful with that. So thank you for asking that question. This question does get asked fairly often through our support channels. I was glad to be able to answer this live on office hours. If there are any questions on that particular point, just let me know. Let's see here. Oh, Andrew, I'm sorry. I just, I see right here, missed my question getting answered. We just talked about it. Since it was a relatively short question, I will say the unfortunate thing here right now, he says I'll watch back later. The short answer is no. There's not really a good way to do it. We recognize that's a little bit of a hole in the process right now, that you can't really easily review mode your quick swapped lineups. I'll let you watch back the rest later. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. It is something that we intend to fill that hole, and maybe do something like you mentioned about giving you an ability to just upload your whole entries file or something like that and review mode all your entries later. So watch that back later. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. I tackled that question first. It was the first one I had saw this morning in the Office Hours channel. So anyway. Okay, cool. Let's see here. I want to talk next about something that we don't often talk about, but we have had some questions today and that came in over the weekend in our support channels, and that is cash games. So wanted to talk, I think our question that came through was general cash game strategy. I saw there was also a question that has since been answered by Matt in the general channel this morning about what settings to use for head-to-heads, and a note that today seems like a good day for playing cash. So let's talk a little bit about cash games. So if you are playing cash games, we do offer kind of a default cash game setting, and what you're going to see is basically correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity get turned completely off. Min salary is going to come up compared to where it typically is. Min projection is going to come up slightly to where it is, and we're actually going to use a slightly different optimizing method to give you something that resembles, actually, no, not even something that resembles. We're going to give you projection-based optimal lineups, right? Using our mean projections here, we're going to build optimals, right? And these are lineups that are good for cash games. So let's just run this and kind of see what we get. I'm using yesterday's slate because it's a little bit of a bigger slate, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So, okay, so you can see I will edit some projections here, and we have our cash game lineups. And this is a great place to start with cash, right? What you're going to see is, in some cases, we are still going to have certain stacks that come up because those players fit really nicely, and maybe particularly have high projections or anything like this. I didn't play yesterday, so I actually don't know a lot about what yesterday's slate looked like, right? But we're not forcing stacks. We don't have a high correlation factor. We're not really going to care about ownership. We're taking the full, with smart diversity at 0, we're taking the complete suite of our sims that we have for players, then using their mean projection across every sim, and we're basically building lineups to optimize for projected score. So you can see these are all extremely high projected score lineups, right? And that's because in a cash game type contest, so we're talking about head-to-heads, we're talking about double ups, we're talking about 50-50s. The goal is to come in the top, I guess for 50-50s and double ups, the goal will be slightly different, but we're basically trying to come in the top half of entries and double our money, right? So talking about cash game strategy here for a moment, SaberSim is going to, similarly to the GPP side, it's going to get you a long way there with our sliders. By turning everything off, we're going to generate mean projection optimal lineups. We save ourselves from some plays that potentially have a little bit lower floor by just upping our min projections slightly. And we protect ourselves from a lower floor of a lineup as a whole by upping our min salary a little bit. We also will allow batters versus opposing pitchers, right? We're not so concerned about negative correlations here. If there is a particularly if there's a great pitcher on the slate, but maybe a min salary hitter against them that has a strong point per dollar projection, we're fine putting them in there, right? Even if those players are negatively correlated, we're not optimizing for upside, so we're okay with that. And this is going to get you a long way there, right? These are going to build you pretty strong lineups that are fitting for cash games, right? This is where cash game strategy starts to get a little interesting, and I think optimal cash game strategy differs here a bit from what the conventional wisdom is, or what maybe the intuitive, what you might intuitively think about cash games. I feel like what is often talked about is or thought of, especially among newer players or newer cash game players, is that there is a projection set or an optimal lineup out there that is dominating and winning all the money. And cash games is really about finding that perfect projection and building the perfect optimal and taking all the money. And in reality, the field of intelligent DFS players for most sports is going to do a pretty good job of identifying the best plays on the slate on a mean projection average basis. And what that means is that your edge in DFS for cash games is actually probably better thought of as the group of entire players that are playing intelligent mean projection optimized lineups, splitting the profits from the pool of fishy players that are not doing that thing, which means your edge, once you've run lineups, projected lineups, is probably best found in your contest selection, right? The goal of your cash game strategy should be significantly based around optimizing your contest selection strategy to find the least skilled players, to be completely honest, right? So what does that look like? We've talked a little bit about contest selection before. For cash games, a lot of the principles are going to be the same. There's going to be some slight differences. First off, if you can play $3 and under contests, play $3 and under contests. Fill up every $3 and under contest before you can play anything above that, right? Players with $1 million in total lifetime winnings on DraftKings, I don't know what the exact number is on FanDuel, but they have a similar restriction, can't play $3 and under, right? You are automatically going to play much less skilled players when you're playing those contests. Second, spread out, right? This is automatically probably going to happen if you're prioritizing lower dollar entry contests, but if you've got $20 to play, you're playing cash, that is better in $21 contests than one $20 contest. $21, yes, better in $21 contest than one $20 contest, right? You want to spread out as much as possible. You don't want to, in cash, everything is kind of optimized, and your winnings are all around finishing in the top half, right? So you don't want to expose yourself to a situation where just because you picked the wrong double up that night and you built a lineup that is in the top 60% of lineups that night, but in this particular one double up you played, it's in the top 53%, and you just lose, right? So the more you spread out, the better you're going to be able to realize your edge on a slate-to-slate basis, right? The other way you can continue to amplify that effect is to play head-to-heads first. Play as many head-to-heads as you can, then start adding in the 50-50s and double-ups when you can't play any more head-to-heads at a certain dollar amount. The reason why is a enormous list of head-to-heads is actually going to allow you to capture where your lineup actually finished in the... Trying to think about the best way to say this. If you imagine every cash game lineup that's entered in a slate for a given night, one of the problems with cash games in general, or one of the things to note, is that if you build a 90 percentile lineup, you're still just going to double your money in the average contest, right? Because it's a double up. If you play a ton of head-to-heads, you will allow yourself to scale your winnings that night based on how strong your lineup was. So the higher percentile overall your lineup was, the more total head-to-heads you're going to win. And the worse your lineup is, the more head-to-heads you're going to lose. But that means on a night like where you have a 40th percentile lineup, right? Your lineup is 40th best out of the average every 100. If you only play double ups, you're probably just going to lose everything. If you play only head-to-heads, you're still going to win, in theory, 40% of your head-to-heads, right? So that's spreading out some risk there. You also, in general, should try to play on bigger slates. Emphasize your cash game. Avoid smaller slates. It is best to play on bigger sports, and it is best to play cash at bigger times of year where there are a lot of other people playing those sports, right? And the reason why is that when you're building, well, let's start here, right? Something like football, NFL, huge sport, huge contests. There's a lot of fishy players that end up just only playing football, cash games or something like that. You're going to have a lot greater edge in playing those kinds of contests than you are in playing something that just doesn't attract as many players, right? The general pool of players is going to be a lot sharper in something like NHL cash, for example, than NFL cash, right? Because there's just way more people joining to come in and play NFL. At the start of every season, you're also going to have some increased edge. So more people come in, start a baseball, start a football, start a basketball, start a hockey, any sport, right? Everyone wants to come in and play those sports at the start of the season. You're going to have some more novice players, some players that aren't going to build as good of lineups in cash games at that starts of seasons, right? Let's see, bigger slates, right? So why do we want to play bigger slates in general for cash? There are probably, realistically, across every different projection model out there, a very small subset of truly cash viable plays on any given slate, right? I don't know, again, what happened yesterday here in these slates. I haven't been able to audit this against anything, but presumably you can kind of see pretty quick. I imagine Corbin Burns was probably extremely popular, and it looks like people maybe ran that back with, I don't know, whoever they did. Again, I didn't play yesterday, but maybe it was like Dylan Cease probably, right, against the White Sox or against the Tigers was probably a pretty popular, right? There's probably across all of these different pitching options, maybe only a handful that sharp players in cash actually used. Actually, let's just see what our cash lineups came out as. That's a good way to do this. So you can see we only built 5, but we have 50 in the pool. Let's even just open this up, right? So our top 50 optimals. There's only 4 pitchers that show up in the top 50 optimals, and then Vince Velasquez shows up in 1, right? So SaberSim here is essentially saying that there were 3 viable pitchers to play on the slate yesterday for cash. And a lot of projection models are going to come up with a similar approach, right? The more pitchers you have on the slate, the more opportunities there are for poorer players to make mistakes. So players that aren't as cash savvy or are maybe making lineups by hand or aren't using projections at all, which are the exact players we want to find in our contests, have however many pitchers to make a mistake here. There were 10 games, approximately 20 pitchers to make a mistake, right? But we compare that to a slate like today where there's 2 games on the slate. There's only 4 pitchers, right? So even if we run a cash build, and probably what's going to happen is we'll probably end up with some lineups that have all 4 of these guys, right? But let's say there was one particular pitcher that was just a must play in cash, and maybe it's Azalea, I don't know. There are just way more opportunities. There are way less opportunities for somebody to make a mistake on a slate like today. So let's look at our first 200 optimals, right? So we have a little bit, it looks like Bundy is like a must play in cash. A ton of players are just going to click on Bundy because there's only 4 pitchers on the slate, right? So we want to play bigger slates for cash to allow poorer players to make more mistakes. Let's see, a couple other notes here I had made. It is always best when you can to prioritize single entry contests for your cash games over multi-entry contests. The reason being, same as GPP, where we think about the sharpest players in the contest are always going to be the ones to max it out. If you have the option of playing a single entry double up or a 50 max multi-entry double up, everyone putting 50 lineups into that multi-entry lineup is going to be sharp. and it's just going to make those contests that much harder to win. So fill up your head-to-heads first, then your single entry 50-50s and double ups. Then if you still can't get all the bankroll you wanted invested into the slate, you can start mixing in some multi-entry double ups, right? So let's see here. We've been talking about cash games for however long it's been, about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. And I spent probably 2 minutes talking about how to build a good cash game lineup. And then I spent about 8 or 10 minutes or whatever it's been talking about your contest selection for cash games. And I want to emphasize that if that's not interesting for you, and contest selection is not an interesting part of your DFS process, first of all, that it probably should be a bigger part, but you are especially probably not a cash game player, right? The edge that you are going to find in playing cash games is vastly related to your contest selection, and then minorly in the form of finding a projection model worth its salt, like SaberSim. But there are other options out there, of course, and building your optimal lineup, right? I would say there are a few more things we can squeeze out some additional edge in actually building our lineup. So we'll talk about that in a second, but that's the way you should be thinking about this, right? 20% of your effort is going to be into building that strong cash game lineup. 80 or so percent is going to be from there building out your contest selection. Let's see. It looks like Ross just chimed in here via YouTube and said, make sure you check the effective entrance for double up contests. My cash game ROI is directly correlated with the number of effective entrants. More effective entrants equals more fishy players. It's exactly right? That's the same reason why we want to be very cautious with those multi-entry double ups and things like that. Those can be extremely hard contests to turn a profit in over the long run. I am going to pull up something I worked on this morning, and let me see here. So in talking about squeezing out that little bit of extra edge you can, this I think is going to be useful for the next question I want to talk about as well. But I worked on this morning. I'm not the first person to do this. You guys have some of you have probably seen this before, right? But this is basically truth tables for different scenarios, looking at whether a player is highly owned or low owned, and whether a player in GPP is high owned or low owned. And then from there, whether or not you as the player are playing them or fading that player, and then whether or not that individual player is having success or failure, right? So these are like very, very simplified game theory truth tables about why, like if you've never actually sat down, why do I want to fade the chalk in a GPP? This will kind of explain why, and it has some impact on cash games too, or why we in general want to play higher owned players in cash. So let's kind of talk about this, right? So again, what we're looking at, let's start at the top with a cash and a highly owned player. And the options are we're either going to play or fade them. And then that player is either going to have success or they're going to fail, right? And I'll explain what like alive and dead and win and what all this means here in a second. But let's just say, for example, we have the highly owned player and we play them in our lineup, right? And if that player succeeds, we're essentially alive, right? So I would say like high owned player, it depends on the size of the slate. But let's just assume, like, for example, we're talking about a player that's like extremely chalky, 30 or 40% owned or something like that on a typical slate in GPP. If you play them and they succeed, and our goal in cash is to come in the top 50%, we're right there, right? We're with everybody, the other 50, 60, 70% of players that took that player. We're in that top half and we're good to go, right? So that's good. If that player fails, and this is the extremely chalky cash play of the night, we're probably still alive, right? There's going to be some minority of people that failed to put that player in their lineups, and they're all of a sudden going to get a boost. But when our goal is to come in the top 50% of lineups, this doesn't kill us, right? So again, like losing our example from yesterday, where we over 50 cash lineups, we saw that Corbin Burns was in 100% of them, right? I assume he was extremely chalky in cash yesterday, and let's assume he failed. We'd still be alive. We'd still have a chance to cash, right? If we fade that player and he succeeds, lineup's dead. Unless you have some other highly or extremely low-owned play in your lineup. And if you faded the chalky player and they go off, you're going to be very much so in the bottom 10 or 20% of lineups in the contest, and you have an extremely unlikely chance to cash. Now, let's say you fade him and he fails, right? So all of a sudden now you're in that top 10%. So you probably are going to end up with a top 10% finish in that contest for that night, right? You faded the chalky pitcher. He got lit up. And you might even win or have like a top 1% outcome. But I said, but who cares, right? And this is where it's really important. This is where a lot of this nuance comes in. Winning a 50-50 is like a participation trophy, right? You get your 2 times return just like everybody else, and you move on to the next slate. You get nothing out of it. You're not paid for having that top 1% outcome lineup, right? So we can see what are the actual outcomes that take place on the high owned player. If we play him, whether he succeeds or doesn't, our lineup doesn't really. Think about this, right? We're not really sacrificing our floor here in terms of the contest, no matter what happens. If we fade him, our lineup can die if he does really well, or we can be catapulted to the front of the lineup, but we don't stand to gain anything here. So let's talk about the low-owned player, right? We're going to see basically the exact same chart, but it's going to be flipped. If we play him and we're right, same thing. We win, but who cares? If we play him and he fails, the opportunity cost of that player that is extremely low-owned, that makes the floor of our lineup much lower, but doesn't affect 90% of the other lineups in the contest, we might be drawing dead. We might not be able to overcome that, especially at a position like pitcher or quarterback in football or something like that, where the opportunity cost of that player is so high, it's very difficult to recoup that loss. Vice versa, if we just fade that player, right? If he's low-owned and we just fade him, if he succeeds, there's maybe 5%, 10% of the players in the contest that are going to get jumped right up to the top, but they don't stand to make any more money because of that. And if he fails, no harm, no foul, right? So you can see this start to come together. Let's talk now about GPP and how it differs there, right? So we're talking about the highly owned player, right? So in this case, same deal. We play him, he succeeds, and I would say our lineup is alive in this case, right? Sometimes in basketball or something like that, there's the player that is so highly projected. Maybe it's the point guard that's all of a sudden starting at min price. He's so highly projected. He goes 9x, and you have him in your lineup, and your lineup is alive, I guess. But again, you're maybe in the top 40 or 50% of lineups at that point, and you're not going to end up standing to gain that much by playing that player. And if you play him and he completely fails, your lineup's just done, right? You're sunk. If 60% of the players or 60% of the lineups have a player and you're included, really in GPPs, honestly, if the player fails, you're probably just and you rostered him and he fails, you're probably just dead anyway, right? Play and failure for GPP, no matter what, is always just going to be dead. But if you fade him in this particular case, right, and he succeeds, in that case, it's probably over. You're on to the next slate. That happens all the time. This is kind of the one win condition for the GPP side, right? Where you stand to gain if the highly owned player fails. I know I've been talking about this here for a while. I'm sure most of you guys watching here are starting to get the idea. I know these are pretty simple tables, so I won't spend too much time on this last one. It's kind of the reverse option, right? The win condition surrounding the low owned player in GPP is to play the low owned player and he succeeds, right? So that's kind of the difference here. This is between GPP and cash in terms of why we think about ownership and let me think about the right way to say this, like what our desired outcome is. In GPP, we really only care about this outcome. But in cash, we're trying to capture as many of these outcomes as possible because we don't really benefit when we take first in the cash cash contest. But we need to try to keep our lineups alive. We need to keep the potential floor of our lineups high, right? So you can see it is to our benefit in general to try to play highly owned players in cash, and it is to our benefit in general to try to fade lowly owned players in cash, and vice versa for GPP. And this is kind of the breakdown of how that general sentiment that a lot of people just know intuitively now comes from. So let's move on here and talk about kind of how we can then use that to squeeze out a little extra edge in our cash lineups. And I actually think this was mentioned by the user that actually sent this message in support. But this is a very good idea. What am I doing? Oh yeah, let's go back. So let's go back to looking at a main slate. So one way you can kind of do this is just to keep an eye on your ownership numbers. And when you're looking at cash lineups and maybe you're building 5 or 10 or something like that, keep an eye out for players. On baseball, it's a little harder because there are going to be some of those lower owned players, especially on the hitting side. But I would say in general to keep an eye out for red flag lineups where a player is particularly low owned, and just make sure that you have an understanding of maybe why that player is popping up. So you can see it looks like Adam Engel is a player that was min salary that we just have just this absurd value. So you kind of at least have some justification for why he's popping up here, even though he's low owned. But one of the easiest ways you can get yourself closer to the field, right, and find yourself becoming closer to those projected, those highly owned plays in cash games, is to do the opposite of what we do with GPP and just get yourself closer to Vegas, right? Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Ugh, sorry about that, guys. Let me back up here a little bit. Sorry about that. So what I was doing here is we were back on our slate from yesterday. We were looking at some of the cash game lineups. And what I was saying here is to kind of look at red flag lineups where maybe there's a player that is extremely low owned, right? Hang on. So I had said Adam Engel's name, who is a player that we have at a very high value because he's min salary, but is somebody that maybe not a lot of other people are playing. And I mentioned with baseball, it can be a little tricky just because there's so many hitters in the pool that this isn't always the easiest thing to do. But in a sport like football or basketball, right, it can be a lot more of a red flag if in your cash lineup, somebody is just popping as being exceedingly low owned. That might expose you to the risk we had talked about on those game theory tables, right? But what I then mentioned is one of the easiest ways you can get yourself much closer to the field is the opposite of what we do with GPP, and that's just getting yourself right up against Vegas, right? Like I would say it would probably be a very useful thing if you're building cash lineups with SaberSim is to just match up some of your team totals to the Vegas totals, because it is possible, right, that we have a little bit of increased edge with SaberSim, that maybe yesterday, let's say the Astros were actually at like a 5-2 implied total from Vegas, and we had them at almost a half run greater, right? And maybe we're a little bit actually more accurate. We have a better read on that game, but the field is kind of treating them at 5-2. And if they roster less Astros players, right, baseball's really variant. And that's kind of the general chalky cash construction. If you are very exposed on Astros players and they're not highly owned, right? We come back to our table here. Let's come back to this one more time. We come back to our table, right? We were over on Astros players, but baseball variance is weird. They didn't do as well. And our lineups are dead because nobody else has them, right? So it may be better instead to have been on. Again, it would have been helpful. This is what happens when I take a day off. It would have been helpful to have played yesterday to kind of known the context of the slate. But I think Dodgers were pretty chalky. Maybe Vegas actually had the Dodgers at like 5.5 runs. It might be better to be on the Dodgers just so you are on the right side of that kind of game theory outcome. So I spent a lot longer on that than I originally planned. Hopefully that was helpful kind of talking through that. So like in summary here, right? 20% of your work on cash games is just building that optimal. You don't need to do a lot of extra work. And then 80% of that is going to be proper contest selection to go seek out those players that are building by hand, that are building bad optimals, that don't know what they're doing, and win their money, right, in their head-to-heads. From there, you can squeeze out a little bit of extra edge by looking at things like Vegas and ownership and what the field is overall going to do and latching yourself onto them, by which increases the overall effective floor of your cash lineup. So hopefully that was clear. Hopefully that was helpful. And I think it was Adam in support that asked that question. So Adam, I will shoot you over a recording of this if you watch this later. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. But that's kind of, I really want to stress that, like, your time is not best spent min-maxing your cash game lineup, because the players whose money you're trying to win over the long term is not the player that's using some other random, relatively sharp projection system, right? You're trying to win the players who really doesn't know what they're doing at all in cash, right? That's the way I think about it. Last thing I'll say on this is I'll qualify this by saying I don't play a lot of cash anymore. I think your realistic ceiling ROI is quite a bit lower than it is with GPPs. I think if you turn a 10% ROI in your cash games over the long terms, you are elite. If you are turning a 5% ROI over the long term in your cash games, you are probably very, very good. And if you are breaking even in cash games and beating the rake, you're probably still probably a pretty solid cash game player. So ask yourself, what is a realistic volume for you to get in your cash games over the course of a month or so? And think about those numbers, 5%, 10% being like very extremely good cash game players, and ask yourself if that's like worth the investment. Because I think you need to have a fairly high bankroll to justify playing a lot of cash. So I will leave it there. I spent a lot of time talking about cash games today. But I will move us on to the next question. If there's any other questions about that, I haven't seen anything pop in office hours or on YouTube apart from Ross's comment. Ross, I know also if you're still tuning in here, I know you've told me that you play quite a bit of cash still, or at least have in the past. If you have anything else to add on there, feel free to hop in with another comment. Or maybe if we have some interest in it, we can look at doing a cash game strategy session here in the near future, and maybe pull a few other folks that play a little bit more cash on the day-to-day than I do. But that is kind of what I have learned. I have a lot of cash game history in my entries, particularly on NFL, but I have played quite a bit less lately. So, okay, cool. I'm going to move us on. There was a question here from Phantom in reference to today's slate. I don't know where he said this, but he said maybe we talk a little bit about some short slate MLB strategy. And with 15 minutes left here, unless there are any other questions, I think that's a great idea. Where's that? I don't know where he asked that. I will just go ahead and say short slate MLB strategy and put this up here just so people can see what we're talking about, right? Okay, so let's jump back to today. First off, baseball and basketball play very differently, but on short slates, a lot of the principles hold up for both sports. So if you haven't seen our NBA strategy session on short slates from last week, I highly recommend you go back and check it out, because a lot of the concepts I'm going to talk about here are pretty similar. What we talked about in that strategy session is really, I guess, boiled down to kind of 2 or 3 broad concepts, and that they are: one, you need to very much actively avoid your lineup being duplicated on short slates. And you need to take very aggressive stands to have an edge over the long term, right? And what you are going to see is in baseball short slates for something like tonight with this 2-gamer, our default sliders are going to get you very close to something like that. All right. We're going to have a high ownership fade. We're going to have a very high smart diversity, right? We are very much trying to take advantage of upside of certain players, right? And let's see what we kind of get out of this, just to take a look. Actually, let's go ahead and use the build we already have to save time, because I know we are coming up on time here. And we can take a look at really what we are getting out of this. Actually, let's just start here, right? So you can see how SaberSim has this slate laid out, right? It essentially has the Angels as the best hitting spot on the slate overall. And basically all three of the other teams has rough equivalents in terms of their expected output, right? And if we look at what Vegas thinks about this slate to just compare for maybe a better word, what is the field going to think about this slate? They're going to generally agree the Angels look like by far the best hitting spot on the slate, and these three other teams are all roughly equal in expected output, right? So one of the principles that we talked about in our NBA strategy is that you need to take aggressive stands on chalk to create an edge for yourself on slates like this, right? In baseball, a highly variant sport, I would say you need to even be more cognizant of the chalk that you're getting on a certain slate. So let's rerun this. Actually, I am going to start with a brand new build. And to me, I would probably be very hesitant to play Angel stacks, knowing that one, they are the most popular stack, it looks like, on the slate. But also SaberSim is slightly under on them compared to where we are on Vegas, right? I would say the field is going to assume that the pitching that either Bundy or either of the pitchers in this game are likely the same, like have essentially the same outcome potential. And the worst pitcher on the slate is probably the Royals pitcher, right? So to me, that stands as another opportunity where you could kind of take advantage of some chalk. So if we look at what we are getting out of this, we are going to see, let's see. Let's just go ahead and like round that up there. Okay. So we are eating some chalk here with Bundy, and it looks like we're also going to end up playing a fair bit of Angels stacks, comparatively speaking, but there's only 4 games on the slate. So I would say, let's see, who's our most popular big stack? I would say that this is best thought of as just something to be like aware of, right? You're going to have to kind of build your own lineups here and decide how risk averse you want to be. But it looks like SaberSim in this particular case is actually being a little bit more friendly to some of the chalk than I might have expected. But one of the lessons we learned from that strategy session is to really not be scared of taking aggressive stands, right? I might think about maybe even being a little bit more aggressive with the way I'm handling the Angels if these were my lineups, because there's just so few games on this slate. We have to find that edge somewhere. And in baseball, like a 1 difference run implied total on a 4-game slate is not going to, should not have the impact I think it is going to on the ownership for the Angels, right? A couple other notes we can talk about there. Things that we discussed also in that strategy session is there is 1 extra player in your, actually, I think there are 2 extra players in your baseball lineups on DraftKings compared to basketball. There are 10 players in your lineup for baseball and 8 in your lineup for basketball. So that means you are less likely to be duplicated because there are just more players, right? You have to pick more guys. But this is also another situation where you can definitely justify dropping your max salary down a little bit to avoid some duplication. I would also say this is a good time to look at what the lowest projected hitters are on the slate. So let's see. Okay, so in this particular case, the lowest projected hitter we have is Nicky Lopez, who has a 5.4 projection. So you will at least have access to that player on a minimum, with a minimum projection of 5. If this player's projection was, for example, 4.5 or something like that, or if there were a handful of players that had a projection of under 5, I would definitely consider dropping your min projection down to capture those players in your pool. Because even though they have an extremely low projection overall and are a player that we may not, probably the back of the order, you'll see 9, 8, 8, 9, right? Guys that typically we don't maybe want on a much bigger slate. On a slate like this, that's another way you can capture some edge, right? Is by getting some guys. We talked about this in the form of minutes upside for NBA. I would say there's some like batting order upside here where, you know, the guys at the top of the order probably maybe hit one more time in the game. That happens sometimes. But bottom of the order guys on a 2-game slate are going to have 3, 4, 5 at-bats just like everybody else. And you'll see these guys, right, have some of the upside here, just like anyone else that's hitting that night. So smart diversity at 10 is going to, or smart diversity at 10 on some of these is going to allow you to get access to some of those players if you make sure that your minimum projection is low enough to allow them to show up in your lineups, right? And I actually wonder, looking back at this now, like I bet some of our Angels stacks are taking advantage of things like that. Let's look. All right, we're thinking Angels are probably the chalkiest stack. So you can actually kind of see, right? Like we're playing, in this case, it's a 3. Let's look at Angels 5 stacks, actually. Okay, so our Angels 5 stacks. I wouldn't be surprised in general if some of these are allowing some of those back of the order guys in to maybe get a little bit different. But we have a couple guys here. We had the 7-hole hitter. Anyway, just thinking about that. But so I know we are coming up on time here. I spent so long talking about cash, had a little less time than I thought I would for short slates. But similar to what we talked about for NBA, right? First, take some precautions to avoid duplication of your lineup in terms of maybe dropping your maximum salary, allowing some of those lower projected players or bottom of the batting order players into your lineups. And then don't be afraid to take aggressive stands on the chalk. So I would say in general, I'm actually a little surprised that SaberSim just right out of the box here is being relatively casual in terms of the way it's looking at some of the chalk here. I would not be afraid to take a stand here, right? I think Vegas is implying that the field is going to think there's one best hitting spot tonight. I would be very intentional with Angel stacks if you're going to play Angel stacks, right? And more generally speaking, right, we don't want this to be so much about tonight's slate, more about just MLB short slate in general. Be very careful with your approach to playing the chalk on short MLB slates. And we can come back to our, let's see. Come back to our tables here, right? So everyone is chalky in their own way on a 2-game MLB slate, but what do we stand to gain when we play Angel stacks and they're the highest owned stack, right? We might be alive if they go off and the Angels have 10 runs and nobody else has any, you know, we're alive. You might squeeze out. You might have the perfect optimal lineup the rest of the way there. But our win condition there is better, is to fade. So, yeah, kind of breezed through that here pretty fast. I came up pretty close with some time here. We've only got a couple minutes left. So I would say if you haven't watched it already, go back, take a look at our NBA short slate strategy session, because a lot of the concepts are going to be very similar there to how you might handle something for baseball. But otherwise, let's see. Hopefully that was helpful here. We will be back again tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully we have a little bit more exciting slates to play here. I am going in on this 2-gamer tonight. I am playing myself, but not particularly super excited for it. Just with 2 games on baseball, a little bit harder to find that edge. But we will be back again tomorrow. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to pop them into our Slack channel in office hours or email support@sabersim.com. I will have this recording posted here later this afternoon. If you are watching the recording now, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again tomorrow. All right. Thanks, everyone.